The tornado siren started at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in my backyard, staring at the steel door of my underground storm shelter. Except I couldn't open it. 3 days earlier, the HOA had sealed the entrance and ordered me to stop using the shelter until I brought it into community compliance. At the time, Victoria Harland, the HOA president, called it a routine property issue. Then the weather changed. The sky turned almost black. My phone lit up with a tornado warning, and somewhere beyond the trees, another siren began to sound. I ran toward the shelter and pulled on the handle. Nothing. The HOA's seal held. That's when I saw Victoria across the street, standing beside two of the board members. For the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked scared, because she suddenly realized the same decision she had made to control my property had just trapped the neighborhood's safest shelter behind a locked door, and there was one county document she had never bothered to read. My name is Daniel Mercer, and before that Tuesday afternoon, I had never thought of my underground storm shelter as anything special. It wasn't a luxury feature, it wasn't a selling point, and it definitely wasn't something I ever expected to become the center of an HOA dispute. It was simply part of my property. The shelter had been there when I bought the house in Cedar Ridge Estates nearly 9 years earlier. The previous owner had built it decades before, when the neighborhood was still mostly open land and the surrounding streets were little more than gravel roads. The entrance sat about 30 yards behind my house, beneath a low, concrete structure surrounded by grass and a few mature oak trees. Inside was a narrow set of concrete steps leading down to a reinforced underground room. There were benches along, 2 walls, shelves for emergency supplies, a battery-powered radio, flashlights, bottled water, and an old weather radio mounted above the doorway. Nothing fancy, but it was solid, and more importantly, it worked. I had inspected it every spring. I checked the door seals. I replaced the batteries. I made sure the emergency lighting worked. I kept the entrance clear of leaves and debris. Living in an area where severe storms weren't unusual, I considered that basic responsibility. I never imagined anyone would tell me I couldn't use it. Cedar Ridge Estates itself was a quiet community. The homes were spread across large lots with wide streets, trimmed lawns, and rows of mature trees separating one property from another. There was a clubhouse near the entrance, a small community pool, and a paved walking path that curved around the neighborhood. Most people knew each other. Some residents had lived there for decades. Others, like me, had moved in later because they wanted more space and fewer distractions. I wasn't the type of homeowner who looked for fights with the HOA. I followed the basic rules. I kept my lawn maintained. I submitted requests when I wanted to make exterior changes. I paid my dues on time. And when the HOA sent routine notices, I dealt with them. There had never been a serious problem. That changed when Victoria Harland became president. Victoria was in her mid-50s and carried herself like someone who believed every community issue needed a policy, a form, and a deadline. She was always professionally dressed, usually in a tailored blazer, and she rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her favorite phrase was community compliance. She used it whenever she wanted something changed. At first, I barely noticed her interest in my property. Then, one morning in early spring, I found her standing near the edge of my driveway. She had a clipboard in one hand and another board member beside her. "Daniel," she said, smiling politely. I walked over. "Morning. Everything okay?" She glanced past me toward the backyard. "We're conducting a review of older exterior structures." I looked toward the house. "Okay." Her eyes moved toward the shelter entrance. "And that includes your storm shelter." I didn't think much of it. "It's been there for years." "I understand." She wrote something on her clipboard. "Do you have the original approval documentation?" "For the shelter?" "Yes." "I'd have to look." She nodded. "That would be helpful." Then she walked away. I assumed that was the end of it. It wasn't. 4 days later, I received an email from the HOA requesting documentation concerning the shelter's construction, current condition, and emergency use status. The wording was formal, almost excessively formal. I sent them the documents I had. The shelter had existed long before I owned the house. I included the previous inspection paperwork, the property records I had received at closing, and photographs, showing that the structure had been maintained for years. Victoria replied the next morning. She thanked me for the information. Then she said the HOA still needed to determine whether the shelter complied with current community standards. That was when I started paying closer attention. The shelter wasn't visible from the street. It didn't interfere with anyone else's property. It wasn't noisy. It wasn't causing drainage problems. It wasn't being used for anything except emergency preparedness. So I called Victoria. She answered immediately. "Daniel, I got your email." "Yes. What exactly is the problem with the shelter?" There was a short pause. The structure wasn't constructed under the current HOA guidelines. It wasn't constructed under the current HOA guidelines because it's older than the current HOA guidelines. I understand that. So what needs to change? We haven't determined that yet. I looked toward the backyard. Then why are you asking me for all this paperwork? We're reviewing older structures throughout the community. I almost believed her. Almost, until she added one sentence. Some emergency structures may require additional restrictions. That caught my attention. Restrictions. Access, appearance, maintenance, use. It's a storm shelter. Yes, Daniel. I know what it is. Her tone had changed slightly. I decided not to argue. I told her I would wait for the HOA's written determination. 2 weeks later, that determination arrived. It wasn't what I expected. The HOA claimed the shelter entrance created an unapproved exterior structure and that the surrounding access area did not meet current community standards. They gave me 30 days to submit a modification plan. I called Victoria again. "Are you asking me to remodel an underground storm shelter?" "We're asking you to bring the structure into compliance." "By doing what?" "That will depend on the review." I stared at the letter. "Is the shelter still allowed to be used?" Victoria paused. "Until the review is complete, you should refrain from using the structure." That was the first time I felt genuinely uneasy. Why? Because the HOA hasn't verified its current condition. I looked toward the shelter through the window. I've maintained it for 9 years. I understand. And nobody from the HOA has inspected the inside. We're requesting access. I didn't like the direction this was going. Still, I agreed to a scheduled inspection. I wasn't going to create a bigger dispute over something that might have been resolved with a simple inspection. The inspection happened the following week. Victoria arrived with the HOA property manager and a contractor. They walked around the shelter. They photographed the entrance. They measured the concrete structure. They examined the door. The contractor asked about the electrical system. I answered every question. Then Victoria noticed the emergency markings near the entrance. She stopped. "Who installed these?" "I don't know. They were here when I bought the house." She looked at the property manager. He wrote something down. "What?" I asked. "Nothing," Victoria said, but she didn't sound casual anymore. The next morning, I received another notice. This one was titled Structural Compliance Determination. The HOA stated that the shelter would need additional review before it could be used. I called Victoria immediately. "This doesn't make sense. It's a safety determination." Then, why isn't the county handling it? We're responsible for community compliance. But you're telling me I can't use a storm shelter during a storm. Until the review is complete. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This isn't a garden shed, Victoria. I understand the distinction. Then you understand why this matters. She didn't answer. Instead, she told me the board would discuss the matter at its next meeting. I spent that evening going through every document I had. I found the shelter reference in my original property file. Then I found something else. An older county inspection record. The document was dated years before I had purchased the property. It described the underground structure as an emergency shelter, and beside the description was a notation referring to an emergency access requirement. I read that line 3 times. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I knew it was important, so I made copies. I saved digital scans, and I put the original back in the file. The following week, the HOA board met. Victoria presented the shelter as a compliance concern. She talked about liability. She talked about outdated structures. She talked about protecting homeowners. But she never mentioned the county inspection record. When I asked why, she said the document wasn't part of the HOA's records. I asked whether the HOA had checked the county records. She said that wasn't necessary because the HOA was only enforcing its own governing documents. That answer stayed with me because it sounded confident, but it didn't sound complete. 3 days later, a contractor arrived at my property. He had paperwork from the HOA. Victoria had authorized the shelter entrance to be secured until the compliance issue was resolved. I stood there reading the work order while the contractor explained what he had been instructed to do. I didn't threaten him. I didn't interfere. I simply photographed the notice and asked for a copy. Then I watched as the shelter entrance was secured. The HOA considered the matter settled. Victoria even sent me a short email afterward. The structure is now restricted pending compliance review. I saved that email. I saved every notice, every photograph, every work order. I didn't know it yet, but those records would become very important. Because 3 days after the shelter was sealed, the weather forecast changed. At first, it was just another severe weather system moving through the region. Then the warnings became more serious. Meteorologists began tracking conditions that could produce strong tornadoes. The local emergency office issued alerts. Neighbors started bringing outdoor furniture inside. People checked generators. Families moved vehicles away from trees. And I looked toward the sealed shelter behind my house. I still believed there was time to resolve the situation. Then, at 4:17 that Tuesday afternoon, the first tornado siren sounded. The morning after the shelter was sealed, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was worried about the storm, because I couldn't stop thinking about the work order. I had read it several times the night before. The HOA had described the shelter as an unapproved exterior structure requiring restricted access pending compliance review. That wording bothered me, not because it sounded intimidating, because it was vague. There was no specific structural defect listed, no failed inspection, no dangerous condition, no county violation number, just pending compliance review. I printed another copy and placed it beside the county inspection record I had found earlier. Then I compared the two. The county document clearly identified the underground structure as an emergency shelter. The HOA document treated it like an ordinary structure that could simply be restricted. There was a gap between those two positions. I just didn't know yet how important that gap was. Around 10 that morning, I heard a vehicle pull into the driveway. I looked outside. It was Victoria. She wasn't alone. The HOA property manager was with her, along with a man I hadn't seen before. The man carried a measuring case and a tablet. I walked outside. Victoria stopped near the driveway. "Daniel, we're following up on the compliance order. I already received the order. We need to document the area again." I glanced toward the shelter. "You sealed it yesterday." "Yes." "So what exactly are you documenting today?" "The surrounding access area." That answer immediately caught my attention. "The surrounding area?" Victoria nodded. "The HOA needs to establish where the structure begins and where the community-controlled area ends." I looked at the property manager. "That sounds like a boundary question." He didn't answer. Victoria did. It's simply part of the review. I stepped aside. Fine, just stay within my property. They walked toward the shelter. The contractor measured the distance between the shelter entrance and the tree line. Then he measured from the shelter toward the side of my property. He took photographs. He checked something on his tablet. I watched him carefully. He wasn't inspecting the shelter anymore. He was measuring land. After several minutes, he walked back toward Victoria and quietly showed her something on the screen. Her expression changed, only for a second, but I noticed it. "What is it?" I asked. She locked the tablet screen. "Nothing that concerns you." I almost laughed. "You're standing on my property measuring it." "We're reviewing the HOA's records." "Then I'd like to know what you're reviewing." Victoria looked at me. "You'll receive the appropriate information through the normal process." Then she turned and walked away. I stood there watching them leave. That was the first time I began wondering if the shelter itself wasn't the real issue. That afternoon, I called the county records office. I explained that I had an older property document referencing an emergency shelter and an access requirement. The person on the phone told me they could help me locate historical records, but some older documents were not available online. I asked what I needed to search for. They gave me several terms: subdivision declaration, recorded easement, emergency access agreement, original development plat. I wrote everything down. Then I started searching. For the next several hours, I went through documents associated with Cedar Ridge Estates. The newer records were easy to understand. The older ones were not. Some were handwritten. Some were scanned copies of copies. Several pages had faded stamps. But eventually, I found the original subdivision filing. I printed it, then I found an amendment. Then another. The HOA had been created years after the first homes were built. That alone wasn't unusual, but the original filing contained something I hadn't seen in the HOA's current documents. There was a reference to a designated emergency facility. I went back to my property records. The description appeared to match the location of my shelter. I sat back in my chair. For the first time, I wondered if the HOA had known about this. The next morning, I emailed Victoria. I attached the documents. I kept the message simple. I asked whether the HOA had considered the original recorded emergency use provisions before restricting the shelter. Victoria replied less than an hour later. Her response was short. She said the documents did not change the HOA's position. I read that sentence twice, then I replied, "Can you explain why?" Her response came several hours later. She said the HOA's current rules govern structures within the community, and that older documents would be reviewed if necessary. If necessary. That phrase bothered me. The county record already existed. The HOA wasn't waiting for new information. It was choosing whether the old information mattered. 2 days later, I received another notice. This one gave me 15 days to submit a formal modification proposal for the shelter entrance. The notice also stated that the shelter was not to be used until the HOA approved the modification. He called Victoria. "You're still restricting it?" "Yes." "Even after I sent you the county record?" "The board has not changed its determination." "What modification are you asking for?" "We haven't finalized that. So you're ordering me to modify something without telling me what needs to be modified?" "We're asking you to cooperate with the review." I looked down at the notice. "No, you're restricting an emergency shelter without identifying an actual violation." There was a pause. Then Victoria said something that made me stop. "You're making this much more complicated than it needs to be," I answered calmly. "I think the paperwork made it complicated." She ended the call. That evening, I started organizing everything. I created a folder on my computer, then another physical folder. Every HOA email went into it. Every letter, every photograph, every inspection note. Every document from the county. I even saved the contractor's work order. I didn't know exactly where this was going, but I knew that if the HOA wanted to make this a documentation issue, I was going to document everything. 3 days later, something unexpected happened. One of my neighbors, a retired firefighter named Harold Bennett, knocked on my door. He looked uncomfortable. I heard about the shelter. I invited him inside. He told me he'd lived in Cedar Ridge Estates for more than 20 years. Then he said something I hadn't expected. That shelter wasn't always considered part of your property. I frowned. What do you mean? Harold explained that when the neighborhood was first developed, several emergency structures had been discussed. He couldn't remember the exact details. But he remembered hearing that my shelter had been part of an older emergency plan for the area. I asked where he had heard that. He said it had been mentioned during a neighborhood meeting many years ago. Do you have anything written down? No. He thought for a moment. But I might know someone who does. Before leaving, Harold gave me the name of another longtime resident, Margaret Lewis. According to Harold, Margaret had kept old neighborhood records for years. I called her the following morning. She remembered the shelter. More importantly, she remembered the original developer. She said the developer had built several emergency features before the HOA existed. Then she said something that made me sit up straight. I remember there being a map. What kind of map? A development map. The original one. Do you still have it? There was a pause. I might. That afternoon, Margaret searched through her old files. She called me back. I found something. What? The original subdivision packet. I asked if I could see it. She agreed. When I arrived at her house, she placed a large, faded folder on the dining room table. Inside were old newsletters, meeting notes, maps, and copies of documents from the neighborhood's earliest years. Then she pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was a development map. She spread it across the table. I immediately recognized the shape of the neighborhood. The roads were different. Several lots hadn't even been developed yet. But there was one marking that caught my attention. A small symbol near my property. Margaret pointed at it. That was the emergency shelter. I looked closer. Next to the symbol was a narrow line extending toward the road. What is this? She adjusted her glasses. I think that's an access corridor. I stared at the map. The line didn't stop at my property. It continued toward what was now the HOA clubhouse area. I took a photograph of the map with Margaret's permission. Then I asked her one question. Why would the HOA seal the shelter if this was part of the original emergency plan? Margaret didn't have an answer, but she did have one final piece of information. The HOA wasn't the first organization managing this neighborhood. I looked at her. What was? She folded her hands over the map. The original development committee. I knew immediately what that meant. There was another layer to this. The HOA wasn't simply enforcing a rule against an old structure. It might have been trying to control something that existed before the HOA itself. That night, I pulled up the HOA's current community map. Then I compared it to Margaret's old map. The differences were subtle, but one area stood out. The emergency access corridor on the original map wasn't shown the same way on the current HOA map. On the current map, that strip appeared to be part of the community-controlled area. On the old map, it was clearly connected to the emergency shelter. I zoomed in, then I checked the property records again. The same area appeared in an older legal description. I didn't sleep much that night because I finally understood what Victoria's contractor had been measuring. They hadn't been measuring the shelter. They had been measuring the land around it, and if I was right, the HOA wasn't trying to control a storm shelter. It was trying to establish control over the access corridor that connected it to the rest of the neighborhood. The next morning, I received another email from Victoria. There was no greeting this time, just a request for another inspection. And at the bottom of the message was a sentence that changed everything. The HOA is reviewing whether the emergency access area falls within community-controlled property. I stared at the Screen. They were finally admitting what I had suspected. The shelter wasn't the real question. The land around it was. The email from Victoria stayed open on my screen for several minutes. The HOA is reviewing whether the emergency access area falls within community-controlled property. That was the first time they had put the real question in writing. I forwarded the message to the county records office and to a local property attorney named Rachel Kim, whom a neighbor recommended. Rachel didn't tell me I had a guaranteed case. She didn't make any dramatic promises. Instead, she asked me to send her everything: the original property documents, the HOA notices, the contractor's work order, the county inspection record, Margaret's old development map, and the photographs I had taken before the shelter was sealed. 2 days later, Rachel called. "I've reviewed the documents," she said, "and there are enough inconsistencies that I wouldn't recommend confronting the HOA yet." I leaned back in my chair. "Why not?" "Because we don't know exactly where the emergency access corridor was established. So we need another survey." Exactly. That became the next step. Rachel arranged for a licensed surveyor named Marcus Reed to review the current property lines against the original development records. Marcus arrived on a cool Thursday morning carrying a tripod, measuring equipment, and a thick folder of county documents. He walked the property slowly. He checked the existing markers. Then he compared them with the older map. For several hours, he barely said anything. Finally, he called me over. "There's something unusual here." He pointed toward the ground near the shelter. "What?" "This boundary marker doesn't match the current HOA map." I looked down. A small metal marker was partially hidden beneath the grass. Marcus cleared the area around it. The marker had an older survey number stamped into the metal. He entered the number into his notes. "I'm going to verify this against the recorded plat." I nodded. For the first time, I felt like we were getting somewhere. Then Victoria sent another notice. This one wasn't about the shelter, it was about my property taxes. The HOA claimed that because the emergency access area was allegedly community-controlled, I needed to provide documentation showing why I had been maintaining the area. Rachel read the notice and immediately shook her head. "They're mixing two separate issues." "What does that mean?" "They're trying to establish control by treating maintenance as evidence of ownership." I looked at the document. "So, because I mowed the grass, they're saying it's theirs." Not exactly, but they're trying to create a narrative. That word stayed with me. Narrative? The HOA wasn't simply investigating anymore. It was building a case, and I realized I needed to do the same. I created a timeline. The first inspection, the compliance notice, the shelter restriction, the contractor's visit, the survey, the old map. Every step went into the file. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was beginning to notice. Some residents supported Victoria. They believed the HOA needed authority to maintain order. Others started asking why an emergency shelter had been sealed in the first place. One neighbor posted a question on the community forum. "If this is an emergency shelter, why is the HOA restricting access?" The post disappeared within an hour. That bothered me more than I expected. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply saved a screenshot. Then another neighbor contacted me privately. She told me that her father had lived in Cedar Ridge before the HOA was established. According to him, the emergency shelter had been part of the original development plan. She didn't have documents, but she remembered something else. The county used to inspect it. That detail mattered. Rachel contacted the county again. This time she asked for the complete historical file associated with the shelter. A few days later, we received a scanned copy of an older inspection packet. There was a maintenance report, a site diagram, and a reference to an emergency access route. But the route description was incomplete. One page was missing. Rachel wasn't discouraged. She was actually more interested. The missing page is probably the part we need. I stared at her. How do we find it? Archives. So we went back to the county records office. An archivist helped us search the original filing boxes. After nearly an hour, she brought out a thin folder. Inside was a photocopy of the missing page. Rachel placed it on the table. The document described the shelter as a designated emergency facility associated with the original development. And the access route wasn't described as HOA property. It was described as an emergency access corridor. I looked at Rachel. So they can't just seal it? She shook her head. I'm not saying that yet. Why? Because we still need to know how the corridor was recorded and whether anything changed afterward. Another question. Another document. Another missing piece. That was becoming the pattern. Then Marcus called. His survey was finished. I met him at the property. He had marked several points along the ground with temporary stakes. The current property line is different from what the HOA map suggests. My stomach tightened. How different? Enough that the shelter access area needs a closer look. He showed me the survey. The emergency corridor appeared to cross an area the HOA had been treating as community-controlled, but the recorded plat showed something more complicated. The corridor was connected to my parcel, and there was another notation beside it, reserved for emergency access. I stared at the words. Does that mean the HOA owns it? No. Does it mean I own it? Not necessarily in the simple sense you're thinking. Marcus pointed to the survey. It means we need the underlying legal description. Rachel agreed. She told me not to make any assumptions until the title records were reviewed. Then she asked a question. Daniel, has the HOA ever tried to modify the area around the shelter before? I thought about it. No. Any construction? No. Any drainage work? No. Then why now? I didn't have an answer, but Victoria's contractor measuring the corridor suddenly made more sense. The HOA wasn't just worried about an old shelter. Something about that strip of land mattered to them. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Victoria sent me a formal notice requiring me to attend. The letter stated that the board would review the shelter's compliance status and determine whether further restrictions were necessary. Rachel told me to attend. But don't argue. I wasn't planning to. Let them explain their position. The meeting was packed. More homeowners showed up than usual. Victoria sat at the front with the board members. She presented photographs of my shelter. She described the structure as outdated. She talked about liability. She talked about emergency management. Then she made the statement I had been expecting. The HOA believes the access area falls under community control. I raised my hand. Victoria looked at me. I stood. I have a county survey showing a different boundary. The room became quiet. Victoria's expression hardened. Those records are still under review. Rachel spoke from beside me. That's correct. They're under review because the HOA's current map doesn't appear to match the recorded documents. Victoria looked at her. And are you saying the HOA has no authority over the area? Rachel answered carefully. I'm saying ownership and HOA regulatory authority are separate questions, and neither has been conclusively established by the documents currently being presented. For the first time, Victoria didn't have an immediate response. The board postponed the decision. It looked like a small victory, maybe even the false victory I had been waiting for. But Rachel wasn't celebrating. Outside the clubhouse, she pulled me aside. Daniel, there's something else. What? The shelter isn't the only structure mentioned in the older records. I stared at her. What else is there? She lowered her voice. An old emergency use agreement connected to the original development. Where? That's what we're trying to find. She handed me a copy of the survey. Then she pointed to a parcel near the neighborhood entrance. I recognized the building immediately. It was the Cedar Ridge HOA Administrative Office. Rachel looked at me. And if I'm reading this correctly, that parcel may have a much more complicated history than anyone on that board realizes. I looked toward the clubhouse, then toward the HOA office, then back at the survey. Suddenly, the sealed storm shelter didn't feel like the whole story. It felt like the first piece of it. The next morning, Rachel called me before I'd even finished my coffee. "Daniel, we found it." I knew immediately what she meant. "The agreement?" "Yes." I sat down at the kitchen table. "What does it say?" There was an original emergency use agreement attached to the development records, and there are two things you need to understand. I waited. First, the shelter wasn't simply listed as an optional feature of your property. She paused. It was part of the original emergency access plan for Cedar Ridge. I looked toward the backyard. And the second thing? The access corridor was reserved specifically for emergency use. I felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. So the HOA couldn't just seal it. Not based on the documents we found. She told me she wanted one final certified copy from the county before making any formal demand. That made sense. I had learned by then that being right and being able to prove you were right were two different things. So we waited. By early afternoon, the certified record arrived. Rachel opened the file while I sat across from her. The first pages were the same documents we had already seen, the original development plat, the emergency use agreement, the recorded property description. Then she reached the final page. She stopped. "What?" She turned the document toward me. There it was, a clause that had been referenced in the original. Development records but omitted from the HOA's current property map. The emergency access corridor had been reserved for access to the shelter and could not be obstructed by a later community rule. I read the sentence twice. So the HOA knew this existed? Rachel shook her head. "We don't know that yet. But they had the records. They should have been able to find them." That distinction mattered. Rachel didn't accuse Victoria of deliberately hiding anything. She simply explained that the HOA had acted on incomplete information. And that was about to become very important. Because later that afternoon, the tornado warning became a tornado emergency. The weather alert on my phone changed. The language was no longer about watching the weather. It was about taking immediate protective action. I looked outside. The sky had turned dark enough that the trees at the edge of the property looked almost black. Then the sirens began. I ran toward the shelter. The entrance was still sealed. For a moment, I simply stood there. 3 days earlier, I had been angry about the HOA's decision. Now, I wasn't angry. I was scared. I pulled on the door. It didn't move. I tried again. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Victoria. She had come down the road with 2 board members. She looked toward the sealed entrance. "Can you open it?" I looked at her. "You're the one who ordered it sealed." "I know." "Then you know I can't." She looked at the lock. Her face had changed completely. There was no clipboard, no formal notice, no confident explanation about community compliance, just a woman standing in front of a shelter during a tornado warning. One of the board members asked, "What are we supposed to do?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. "Rachel." I stepped a few feet away. "Daniel, listen carefully." "I know." "No, you need to hear this. The county has confirmed the emergency use provision." "What does that mean right now?" "It means the HOA's restriction is not something they can simply continue enforcing as though it were an ordinary architectural rule." I looked toward Victoria. "Can you send that confirmation?" "Already did." My phone buzzed. I opened the email. It came from the county records office. The wording was neutral. No accusations, no dramatic language, just confirmation that the recorded documents identified the shelter and access corridor for emergency use. I showed it to Victoria. She read it, then read it again. "This doesn't say the HOA did anything wrong." "No," I said. It says the documents need to be followed. Yes. She looked at the sealed entrance. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then she asked, "Can it be reopened?" Rachel was still on the phone. "Daniel? I heard you. If the shelter is structurally safe and the seal can be removed without creating another hazard, the emergency access issue should be handled immediately through the appropriate local process." That was when I called the county emergency office. I explained the situation. The official didn't take sides. He asked for the shelter address, the recorded information, and the details of the restriction. I sent everything. A short time later, he called back. He told me the county records supported the shelter's documented emergency function. He also made something very clear. The HOA's internal rules don't replace the county's recorded property information. I thanked him. Then I turned toward Victoria. She had heard enough. "I'll contact the board," she said. I shook my head. "You don't need a board meeting right now." She looked confused. "Then what do you want?" "Follow the emergency procedure." For once, she didn't argue. The contractor who had originally secured the entrance was contacted. He arrived with another worker. They inspected the seal and confirmed it could be removed safely. Then they reopened the entrance. No one celebrated. There wasn't time. The sirens were still sounding. Neighbors moved toward the shelter in an orderly way. Families gathered. People who had previously supported Victoria's decision were now seeing the consequences for themselves, and Victoria stood off to the side. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't defending herself. She was looking at the county document on her phone. The storm passed without the catastrophic outcome everyone had feared. But by the following morning, the issue had changed completely. The HOA could no longer describe the shelter as an ordinary structure requiring routine compliance. The documents had settled that question. But Rachel wasn't finished. She asked for one more thing. The original HOA records. What for? "I want to know exactly what Victoria and the board were given when they made the decision. We obtained the board correspondence. There were inspection photographs, compliance notices, the contractor's work order, emails discussing the shelter. And then we found the document that changed the entire meeting. It was an internal HOA review from years earlier. Someone had already flagged the emergency use provision. The note was brief. It said the shelter and access corridor should be reviewed against the original development records before any restriction was imposed. The review had never been completed. Victoria had been given an incomplete file. The board had relied on it, and then they had acted. Rachel looked at me. "This is the evidence you needed." I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, because the whole dispute could have been avoided if someone had simply checked the original records. The HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. This time, the room was packed. Homeowners who had never attended a board meeting before were sitting along the walls. Victoria opened the meeting. She looked different, less certain. She explained that the board had reviewed the county records and the original development documents. Then Rachel presented the evidence. She started with the old development map, then the survey, then the county inspection record, then the emergency use agreement. Finally, she presented the certified county record confirming the emergency access provision. The strongest evidence came last. The room went silent. One homeowner asked, "So the shelter should never have been sealed?" Rachel answered carefully. "Based on the records we've reviewed, the HOA should have completed the property and emergency use review before restricting access." Another homeowner asked, "Who approved the restriction?" The HOA secretary opened the file. The board approved it based on the compliance recommendation. Someone asked, "Did anyone verify the county records?" The secretary looked down. No. That answer changed the room, not because anyone shouted, because everyone understood what it meant. Victoria finally spoke. "I believed we were enforcing the community's rules." I looked at her. I know. She looked toward me. didn't understand that the emergency use agreement was still controlling. Rachel corrected her gently. It wasn't a question of whether you personally understood it. The issue was that the board acted before verifying the recorded documents. Victoria nodded slowly. For the first time since this began, she didn't try to win the argument. She simply accepted the information. Then another homeowner raised his hand. What happens now? Rachel explained that the board would need to formally correct its records, withdraw the shelter restriction, review the emergency access corridor, and establish a procedure for older property records before issuing similar enforcement actions. No one demanded that Victoria be publicly humiliated. No one demanded that the HOA disappear. The evidence was enough. The board voted to rescind the shelter restriction pending the completion of the proper documentation review. Then Victoria made one final statement. I should have checked the original records before approving the restriction. The room went quiet again. I looked down at the folder in front of me. For weeks, the HOA had acted like the shelter was simply another rule violation. But the county records had shown something different. It wasn't just a structure. It was part of an emergency plan that existed before the current HOA rules ever did. And when the tornado sirens finally went off, that difference stopped being theoretical. It became the one fact nobody in that room could ignore. The morning after the board meeting, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet. There were no angry emails, no new violation notices, no messages from Victoria demanding another inspection. For the first time in weeks, nobody was arguing about my storm shelter. But the issue wasn't simply going away. The HOA had to correct what it had done. Rachel helped me submit the complete documentation package to the board. It included the original development map, the county inspection records, the emergency use agreement, the certified property documents, the survey, and every notice the HOA had sent me. The contractor's work order was included too. That mattered because it showed exactly when the shelter had been sealed and under whose authorization. The board reviewed everything with the county records. Within the following week, the HOA formally withdrew the restriction on the shelter. They also removed the previous compliance notice from my property file. More importantly, the board acknowledged that the emergency access corridor had to be treated according to the recorded documents, rather than simply according to the HOA's current property map. The difference sounded technical. But it changed everything. The HOA could still enforce legitimate community rules. It just couldn't assume that every piece of land or every older structure automatically fell under those rules. That distinction was now part of the board's official records. The HOA also changed its enforcement procedure. Any future dispute involving an older structure would require a review of the original property records before enforcement action could be taken. Emergency facilities would receive an additional review, and contractors could no longer be sent to restrict access based solely on an internal compliance notice. The changes weren't dramatic. There was no movie-style collapse of the HOA. Nobody was arrested. Nobody stood up and confessed to some elaborate scheme. The reality was much simpler. The board had made a serious mistake because it acted on incomplete information, and once the documents were properly reviewed, the mistake became impossible to defend. Victoria remained HOA president for the time being. That surprised me, but honestly, I preferred it that way. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the rules to be applied correctly. Over the next few months, Victoria became noticeably less aggressive about enforcement. She started asking for documentation before issuing notices. She stopped treating every disagreement as a compliance battle. At one board meeting, she even recommended that the HOA archive its older development records digitally so future board members wouldn't have to repeat the same search. I wasn't expecting that, but I appreciated it. The homeowners changed too. People who had never cared about HOA documents before began asking questions. They wanted to know what their covenants actually said. They started keeping copies of old surveys and property records, A few neighbors discovered that their homes had their own historical documents that didn't appear in the HOA's current files. The community became more careful, not more hostile, just more informed. As for my storm shelter, I had it inspected again. This time, the inspection was conducted through the appropriate channel. The structure was maintained, the entrance was cleared, and the emergency supplies were replaced. I added a new flashlight, a fresh weather radio, extra batteries, and a printed copy of the emergency access documentation. I kept that copy in a waterproof folder inside the shelter. The original records stayed safely inside my house. I also placed a small binder beside my desk containing every important property document. Not because I expected another HOA dispute, because I had learned something I should have understood years earlier. Never assume that a confident person explaining a rule means they have the complete picture. Check the documents. Check the records. Check the actual authority behind the decision. A few weeks later, I ran into Victoria near the community entrance. She stopped when she saw me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she looked toward the direction of my backyard. "Your shelter is fully restored?" "Yes." She nodded. "Good." I almost walked away. Then she said something unexpected. "I should have checked the old records first." I looked at her. "I wish you had." She nodded again. "I know. That was it. No dramatic apology, no handshake, no sudden friendship. Just an acknowledgement, and honestly, that was enough. The shelter remained where it had always been, underground, quiet, out of sight. But after everything that happened, I never looked at it the same way again. Before the dispute, I thought of it as a room beneath my property. Afterward, I understood that it represented something bigger. It was part of the neighborhood's original emergency planning. It had been there before the current HOA structure, before most of the houses, before many of the rules Victoria had tried to enforce. And when those tornado sirens went off, that history suddenly mattered. The strangest part was that the HOA never needed to become my enemy. The entire situation could have been resolved with one record search at the beginning. Instead, a simple shelter inspection turned into weeks of notices, surveys, legal documents, board meetings, and emergency calls, all because someone assumed the newest set of rules automatically controlled everything that came before them. That was the lesson I took from it. An HOA can have rules, a board can have authority, and a homeowner can still have rights and recorded property interests that exist outside the HOA's interpretation. You just have to know where those rights are documented. And sometimes, you don't discover how important those documents are until the moment you desperately need them. For me, that moment came when the sirens started. I had spent weeks trying to prove that the HOA had no reason to seal my shelter. In the end, I didn't have to win an argument. The records spoke for themselves. And the next time those sirens sounded, the shelter door was unlocked. Exactly the way it should have been from the beginning.